huge wave of German aircraft approached, the island of Crete was defended by a poorly equipped Allied force. Such a huge airborne invasion had never been attempted before or since in war. This is the story of that unique battle and its aftermath. Crete is an island used to bloodshed and invasion throughout its long history. But the invasion and 4-year occupation of the island by German forces marked one of its most violent chapters. Stelios Tripolitakis started collecting memorabilia and relics from the war when he was 15 years old.
These are two 50 caliber machine guns, US made. This I found them in the crash site of a B-24 Liberator, a 4-engine bomber in Want Mountains.
Stelios has travelled all over the island, finding and restoring abandoned equipment, searching it out under the sea and on remote mountaintops.
This is a skin pad from a Stuka Junkers 87 Stuka dive bomber with a 1/4 of the Iron Cross. This is a brand machine gun. This one found in Galatas 3 years ago, buried under a very old olive tree.
Now his private collection, containing 80,000 pieces, has taken over his house in Galatas in western Crete, which saw fierce fighting.
These are German bandage boxes made. This is full, has all the bandages inside. The scissors to cut the bandages. The bandages, this is made in 1942. This is a BMW R12 German motorcycle made between 1935 and 1941. German paratrooper helmets from the Battle of Crete. And this has taken a bullet hole. This shot killed him, you can see here.
Today, war graves of both Allied and German soldiers are scattered across Crete, along with memorials to Cretan civilians and resistance fighters, either killed or massacred by their German occupiers. In May 1941, the German invasion force consisted of 14,000 elite paratroopers who'd be dropped on the island. The aim was to take it from 30,000 Allied soldiers from Britain, Australia and New Zealand, and 12,000 Greek soldiers, tasked with defending it. The airborne invasion would be successful after just 2 weeks, but the campaign was bloody, with both sides inflicting huge losses. For Germany, they would lose more troops on the first day of battle than they'd lost in 18 months of the war thus far. The invasion had been coming for weeks. In the months previous, German troops had pushed down through the Balkans and just a few weeks earlier had taken mainland Greece. The capital, Athens, fell on April the 27th and the swastika was raised over the Acropolis. The Italians under Mussolini had launched the invasion of Greece the previous year, but it was widely seen as a failure. German involvement turned it around.
The German successes in 1940 and 1941 really rewrote the rule book of military operations. They conquered France in 6 weeks when they'd been unable to do so for 4 years in the First World War. And they were able to do so because of the application of mobile warfare using mechanised formations and air power. These were unprecedented developments in military technique.
Thousands of Allied soldiers who'd been defending the mainland had been hurriedly evacuated to Crete, along with members of the Greek government and the King of Greece. Churchill needed to delay and thwart any further German expansion into North Africa and the Middle East, and decided to make a stand in Crete.
It was the end of a string of losses that began with Dunkirk.
Churchill turned to a New Zealand general, Bernard Freyberg, a Gallipoli hero and an old friend, to lead the defence of Crete.
They had been friends after the First World War. Bernard Freyberg turned up at dinner parties at Churchill's house And Churchill would ask him to take off his clothes so they could count all the wounds that Freiburg had in the First World War. Some of which, as Freiburg said, were the wounds going in and the shrapnel bullets going out.
Churchill called him the salamander, and a salamander is something that is reborn in fire. He appeared indestructible.
Crete is 160 miles long, between 7 and 30 miles wide, with 8,000-foot mountains dividing the north coast from a very steep southern coastline. In 1941, there were only 3 main roads connecting north and south. Other routes were no more than tracks and mountain paths.
All other roads were donkey trails, too poor for motor transport.
But from the island, the Luftwaffe could strike to the south, at the British sea routes to Egypt and Cyprus. With Rommel nearing Egypt, the Balkans already conquered, a 5th column waiting in Syria, a drive for Suez was ready, except for Crete.
The Mediterranean is useful for many reasons, but primarily it's a transit route between Western Europe and Australasia, East Asia. It's the artery that connects the whole of the British Empire up and enables the British to use one large fleet to patrol everything from the Atlantic to the China Seas. If you can't use the Mediterranean, that means you have to go all the way around Africa, which is a big problem.
But as the German Luftwaffe buzzed the skies above the island, preparations were made for the evacuation of the king and Greek government to Egypt, an indication as to the diminishing prospects for a successful defense.
Transportation inadequate.
The German invasion would involve an airborne division of the Luftwaffe, developed by Göring a few years before the war. It was known as the Flieger Corps, and the paratroopers were known as the Fallschirmjäger, or in English, Sky Hunters. The Fallschirmjäger were very effective when used in commando-style raids. Many were drawn from old elite Prussian military families and were famous for their willingness to give every effort, unwaveringly, even in the grimmest of situations.
The Fallschirmjäger are a very new force. They actually come from novel work that was done in the Soviet Union in the 1920s and 30s on parachutes and parachute troops. But the Germans organised the force into a whole division. Hitler sees them as an elite force. They are used as the leading regiment in his birthday parade in 1939. He sees them as having operated very successfully in Norway and in Holland and in Belgium in the early part of the invasion of France in 1940. So they're escalating up from this early use to land on Crete.
The German parachute division, the 7th Parachute Division, had been formed really by Göring, partly because he wanted his own private army. Himmler had the Waffen-SS, and Göring went on all throughout the war, right till the very end, trying to increase his sort of Fallschirmjäger parachute units, even though many of them had never parachuted in their lives, purely so that he had a counterpart. The adventurous, lots of Nazis, young Nazi youth, it's true. They weren't entirely Nazi, but there was already in the Luftwaffe itself a higher level of Nazi membership or of Nazi believers than actually in the ordinary army itself.
By this stage, some of the younger ones would have seen some time in the Hitler Youth. They're growing up in the Nazi state. They're growing up in a world where things that we find simply incomprehensibly abhorrent are normative. So they're already desensitized. They've been taught to believe in theories of racial expansion, racial superiority, that it's their destiny to rule the world and their leader is going to carry them on to the new promised land. It's a combination of psychopathic and messianic, and it just resonates. It works. It clearly works because it mobilizes a huge military effort throughout the war.
By contrast, the Allied forces defending Crete were poorly equipped. There had been about 50,000 troops involved in the Greek campaign, 2/3 of them from Australia and New Zealand. The Australian Imperial Force was a volunteer one, the first to be raised since the First World War.
In Greece, an Anzac Corps, the literal meaning of the term, Australia and New Zealand Army Corps, that was only the second time that an Anzac Corps had ever been formed. Obviously the first in Gallipoli and the second in Greece.
There was a shortage of weapons among the defending troops. The 10,000 evacuees from the Greek mainland had been forced to leave a lot of their equipment behind.
At battalion and at brigade and at force level, the Australian and New Zealand commanders were tired. They had fought a very active campaign in North Africa. They'd fought a strenuous and absolutely exhausting fighting retreat through Greece. And so by the time they got to Crete, they were just worn out.
You've got an army that's lost its communications, its artillery and its transport, dumped on Crete because that was the closest bus stop.
Against this background, Freyberg was a reluctant commander. He'd wanted to return to Egypt with his troops after the defeat on the Greek mainland. He cabled his HQ in Egypt, requesting the removal of troops he regarded as useless. Unwanted personnel who did not have weapons and had little or no employment other than getting into trouble with the civilian population. Most were removed before the battle began. The Australians were amongst those accused of behaving badly.
Prince Peter of Greece, who was Prince Philip's uncle, came across some Australians in Canea in a restaurant, and they were drunk and they were annoyed that they'd been run out of Crete, and they were looking for anybody to take it out of. And one of them actually drew a pistol and threatened Prince Peter, who dived under a table, knocked the chap over, and the revolver went off and shot into the wall. So that wasn't really frightfully good behaviour on the part of that particular unit.
Air cover was confined to a handful of planes only. Most would be destroyed on the ground by German fighters. There would be no reinforcements, as Churchill had prioritised Libyan defences in North Africa and for the British base in Malta. This, then, was an army with no air defence.
So the Germans dominate the skies, and although Freyberg has managed to produce defensive positions with a lot of camouflage and bamboozle the Germans as to what's going on, it's still the case that once the Germans are there, they can call on air power, and we really can't.
So we start off with a weak position and we make it weaker by making bad decisions. And when you're on a roll and you're losing all the time, this is an army that's been defeated. They were driven out of Greece pretty chaotically. They lost a lot of the heavy equipment. Their formations are all jumbled up. So they came there on the back of a beating, and they didn't quite have what it took to resist.
The British Navy was effective in neutralising any invasion by sea, but its ships faced a serious challenge from the German Air Force.
So this is an air-sea battle for dominance of an island. And in many ways, the fighting on land is almost incidental. Is the air dominant? Is the sea dominant? If the air dominates, the Navy can't defend the island. If the Navy dominates, the Germans can't get to the island. So that's the seesaw of this whole battle. Who controls the air-sea?
In the weeks before invasion, only 2,700 of 27,000 tons of supplies shipped from Egypt arrived. The rest lost after ships carrying it were attacked by the Luftwaffe. In the days before the invasion, Germany's massive air arsenal was employed to ruthless effect to soften up Allied defences.
So they're training key parts of their Air Force in naval attack. And this is a difficult discipline. Flying over the sea is difficult. Hitting a target that's travelling at nearly 40 miles an hour and is manoeuvring violently and shooting back, that's really difficult. And that takes a lot of training. The best people at doing this in 1941 were the Japanese and the Germans, and they'd practiced a lot. So sinking a fast-moving British destroyer off Crete that's manoeuvring evasively and is trying to counter your attack, that is a real skill. Very few air forces can do this.
Hundreds of aircraft took part, including 200 planes from elite Stuka squadrons, Junkers Ju-87s, known variously as the Sirens of Death, the Flying Swastika, and the Jericho Trumpet, on account of the frightening noise they emitted when in a dive. The Stuka dive bombed to a degree of almost 90 degrees, an angle that had never been seen before, and at a speed of almost 400 miles per hour.
The Stuka is a specialist dive bomber. It's designed specifically to do that mission, to peel over at high altitude and to come down at nearly vertical and hit a fast-moving target with a precision drop weapon. In a clear sky, under complete German control, they are very dangerous.
The backbone of this blitzkrieg-style operation was the fast bomber, the Messerschmitt Bf 109. Almost 35,000 of these were produced by Germany during World War II, fully half of its air fleet, and they were heavily involved in the Cretan air invasion. Also involved was the twin-engined Heinkel HE-111, one of the Germans' most important bombers. It was distinguished by its greenhouse nose, with rotating machine gun turret to allow greater and more precise visibility above targets. And the Dornier DO-17, known as the Flying Pencil on account of its unique, sleek design. The actual airborne invasion was slated to take place on May 20, 1941. It was a unique, high-tech enterprise of its time, the brainchild of World War I German fighter ace General Kurt Student, the head of the Air Corps and architect of a successful and highly innovative air campaign in Holland a year earlier, which carried the Sky Hunters into battle aboard gliders.
But he, like all enthusiasts, is a true believer, so he believes that this is the answer to almost everything. And this is going to be the test case, and the paratroopers will take the island, and it will be just the beginning of a whole new parachute army that he will command. And, of course, by the end of the campaign, there's not much left.
Hitler, like the army, was opposed to the plan, believing it was too costly, but was persuaded by Goering, head of the Luftwaffe. He, like Student, was a World War I fighter ace, and the Fallschirmjäger were his elite force.
Hitler says very famously that the army belongs to the Prussians, and it's a very old army. The navy belongs to the Second Empire because it was created in the 1890s. He said, but the Luftwaffe, that's mine. You know, that was created while the Nazis were in charge. So Goering is a fully signed up long-term member of the Nazi Party. The Luftwaffe is the strike arm of the Nazi Party. That's why its defeat in the air battle over Britain is so significant. This is the first time that the Nazi arm has been defeated in battle. And there is a sense that they see winning in Crete as a kind of payback. So they're prepared to push the envelope here and to sell this as a great Nazi air and elite formations victory plays into the culture of the state.
Codenamed Operation Mercury, it involved over 500 Ju-52 transport planes. These were solid trimotors of corrugated metal, and they would drop the 14,000 paratroopers, elite airborne force of the 7th Flieger Division, from the skies above Crete. They would be supported by another 570 aircraft. The Stukas, Junker 88s, Dorniers, Heinkels, and Messerschmitt's 109s and 110s. The invasion was a showcase of supreme and innovative German air power, perhaps the greatest single example of the entire war. In the days preceding the invasion, these aircraft had been used to soften up defences on the island.
Well, it's blitzkrieg. The Germans don't call it blitzkrieg. They see it as an extension of their operational method that goes back into the 19th century. But an American journalist comes up with the phrase blitzkrieg, lightning war, in 1939 following the invasion of Poland. And Hitler likes the term, and it becomes a term that the Germans use. It's a German operational method seeking decision, and they do it very rapidly. And now it has the addition of new technology, such as air power and tanks.
And commanders, if they weren't First World War veterans, they'd learnt their trade from those who had fought in the First World War. So They were speaking an entirely different language. They had no idea what to expect from an airborne invasion. When they were told that that would be followed up by reinforcements from the sea, they could imagine that. Many of them were Gallipoli veterans, so they had visualised, they had participated in a seaborne invasion. But an airborne invasion, that was totally new.
Leading up to the battle and throughout it, General Freyberg had access to German plans through Britain's secret code breakers at Bletchley Park.
He's having, I think, a cup of tea on the veranda of his outpost with a junior officer, and the news comes that the Germans have landed, and he looks at his watch and says something to the effect of just on time, because of course he knows exactly when they're supposed to be coming, and he's very impressed by the German precision.
But the British have really good intel on this. The ultra material is giving up a lot of information. The Luftwaffe, for all of its ability to drop bombs accurately, is remarkably cavalier about intelligence security.
They knew exactly where the parachutists would be dropped. Under normal circumstances, this would have meant that the Battle of Crete ended at the first day.
In the first wave of the air invasion, 8,000 paratroopers were landed. In another first in aerial warfare, the elite troops were carried aboard DFS 230 gliders. Towed by Junker Ju-52s, the gliders were released a good distance before target, silently descending upon Crete so the sound of towing aircraft would not alert the Allied forces. An objective was to knock out anti-aircraft batteries. In all, 70 gliders, each carrying 10 paratroopers, would land in the first few hours of the battle, many along the dry creek bed west of the strategic Maleme airfield, in the west of the island. The paratroopers came very well equipped, but on them they carried just a pistol, knife and hand grenades for weapons. But they were also kitted out with knee pads and some carried cameras.
It is still functional, you can see. 50% of the German soldiers that were here in the Battle of Crete carried a camera with them because, of course, they wanted to remember the stages of the battle and some of them for propaganda reasons. There were about 50 propaganda company photographers. Of course, the pictures are very different from these individuals.
German parachutists then were armed by a pistol, a knife, and 3 or 4 hand grenades. The real weapons were dropped in a box, and they had to find it.
These well-equipped paratroopers, or sky hunters, became known to the Allies as the Green Devils.
Germans had also chocolate with them. They used to have this chocolate. It's chocolate with caffeine. This firm still exists. It still makes chocolate.
Was first to take 3 airfields on the northern coast, at Maleme, Rethymnon and Heraklion, paving the way for the giant transports to land more troops and supplies in order to take the island.
German intelligence was abominable. It was incredibly arrogant of them to believe that really they didn't have to worry about intelligence because they always won their battles, which had been the case up until then.
The Germans knew nothing about Crete. They believed that they would be welcomed there by the population.
The key airfield was Maleme. This would be defended in a series of bloody and costly encounters, often involving hand-to-hand combat with Allied troops, mainly New Zealanders, and surprisingly for the invaders, with the local Cretan population, who'd formed themselves into militias.
We thought it was going to be a sea landing, and then all of a sudden we hear this humming coming out at the sea towards Crete, and we see it coming in, the big German junker transports. They carry about 150 troops at a time, and they were coming in just at wave height. When they come to the land of Crete, they made sufficient height for dropping off paratroopers. And then when they come over our positions where we were, the paratroopers started spewing out of their planes right on top of our different positions. Well, we looked up in awe and wonderment because we'd been trying to engage people at land level, but never coming down from the sky.
Parachutist is vulnerable, first of all in the air, and secondly, when he lands for a minute or so, he's obviously disoriented. And the New Zealanders particularly took advantage of that.
There's 100, 150 odd paratroopers coming down on top of us, but not many of those hit the land where we were without being hit in some way or other. I didn't have to tell our fellas to let go.
We were delighted to leave the aircraft because we thought they couldn't hit us as easily as they could in the aircraft, but that was not so. In the air I heard this whistling of bullets around me, but the whistling is not so bad to hear because you know everything you hear is already past. It can't hit you anymore. And then I looked down and I saw some soldiers.
The German aircraft had to come low and slow in front of prepared positions. The Australians and New Zealanders were expert infantry units, and given those kind of targets, they didn't miss.
They were coming in at the same level as the anti-aircraft gunners on the ground. They were firing at them without elevating their guns. Of course, made the operation much easier for the gunners. And it was close as well. I mean, the German planes were coming in, the Commonwealth and British gunners were right there. And it gives a sense of the intimacy of the battle and also the power of the air defence put up against the German paratroopers and the force that the German paratroopers had to overcome.
They could see their bullets striking German transport aircraft. They could see the paratroopers going limp as they were hit by the defenders' fire.
There were the New Zealanders and the others who went out literally in sort of man-hunting parties, just shooting them down. And also they did have a few tanks on the island. They had some light whippet tanks, the 3rd Hussars. They went round and they were quite ruthless in the way that they would sometimes just run them down with their tracks and crush them underneath.
They land where they land, and they land right on top of the Allied positions. So in some cases, you'll have British, New Zealand, Australian officers in command posts doing their business of commanding the unit and taking out their service revolvers and shooting German paratroopers landing literally on top of them.
And I took a Bren gunner out and gave them covering fire until they got back into the battalion lines. And they charged in with the bayonets. A chap by the name of Ted Swanson was the sergeant in charge of that platoon, and Ted was out the front. He got a DCM out of it. Castleman got shot through the arm and he come in with one arm hanging down, and we got his arm fixed up. We held it in our area, and there wasn't many of those paratroopers ever landed on without had lead in them. But it seemed like a slaughter to me.
In all drop zones, the paratroopers were dropped in between and around Allied troops, making for a confused battleground with no front lines. At Maleme, the paratroopers were dropped on top of and among battalions of New Zealand troops. At Rethmanon, they were dropped either side and on top of Australian and Greek defenders protecting the airport and the city. It was a similar story in Heraklion, where the paratroopers were set down amongst Australian, Greek and British troops, also defending both the city and airfield.
There are Maori troops, New Zealand Maori troops, going in, taking the paratroopers out as they land with the bayonet. It's very brutal fighting, shooting of prisoners.
One German unit dropped on the 23rd Battalion, New Zealand Battalion. And I think within a matter of hours, 800 out of 1,000 men, Germans, parachutists, were dead.
Also, large numbers of Greek civilians are involved in the battle as well, and they join in and they suffer for it afterwards when the Germans conquer Crete. So it's interesting to see these mixed formations of mixed British and Commonwealth troops, Greek troops and also Greek civilians, some of whom are armed with knives, all attacking these paratroopers who were landing piecemeal and having to fight their battle one by one.
There were even Cretan civilians who were cutting up and killing, stabbing or shooting with shotguns any of the paratroopers caught in the olive trees and unable to struggle out of their harnesses.
Cretans are a fierce and independent lot, and they weren't very pleased to be invaded, tying kitchen knives on the end of broomsticks, and they would be pretty savage when it came to it, yeah.
It's grim, and afterwards it's hot as well. This is May, and the bodies, many of them are hanging from olive trees in their harnesses. The local Greeks often strip off the boots of the paratroopers, and also the pockets are ripped open for any orders that they might have. The British are looking for the intelligence, but the bodies stay there hanging, and they rot very, very quickly.
German paratroopers jumping out of Junkers transports that are already on flame and their parachutes being incinerated. Another Australian veteran recalls seeing one of the paratroopers get caught in the tail of a Junkers transport and fly off into the distance, trailing behind the aeroplane on its way back to Greece. So it was a complex, difficult feat of arms that the Germans were attempting, and when things went wrong, they really did go wrong.
This is a paratrooper's gravity knife. It's a gravity knife because it goes like that. This is a common knife that all the flight crews had with them. When you see such a knife here in Crete, it's a German dead, of course. Cretans love to take these knives from the Germans as a souvenir, of course, along with their Lugers.
The Cretans even took the parachutes, which were made of silk, and made them later into clothes and dresses, even wedding dresses.
German paratroopers who survive, many of them have these, it's like an amphetamine pill to keep them fighting. They're incredibly tired, many of them are dehydrated, they've run out of food, they've run out of water, so their victory is a tribute, and we were talking earlier about the Fallschirmjäger as an elite formation, to their elite status and their willingness to endure the battle when they're there completely on their own, often out of ammunition and often out of basic supplies.
When I had to take aim at another man and shoot him, that was initially very hard. I could see the person I was going to kill, but he hadn't seen me. I hesitated. But I knew I had to shoot because I could see my comrades flying in behind me and that they would be killed if I didn't kill this man. I thought, now I have to shoot. I must. I think about it a lot. It's not the sort of thing you forget.
The key moments of the battle would happen here at the Maleme airfield, at a bridge over the Tavronitis River. The bridge is still here today. Mike Sweet is a writer and historian living in Crete who's researched the key locations of the battle, including what happened here at the bridge.
The battle for Maleme, in fact the battle for Crete, started here in the Tavronitis riverbed. Around 8:30 on the morning of the 20th of May, around 40 to 50 gliders landed, crash landed in many cases, north of the bridge and south of the bridge. On the far bank, the airfield is in the distance, were New Zealand infantry protecting the bridge and trying to stem the German advance. There were about 10 men in each glider, and as the gliders landed, crash landed, many of them were injured even before they started fighting. The plan was to use the dead ground of the riverbed as the line of attack. On the eastern side, there you can see the airfield in the distance, was the New Zealand 22nd Battalion, an infantry battalion that was lined up in front of the airstrip along the banks of the river. These were the men who would try and save Maleme.
The bridge today still bears the scars of what happened here.
We're on the western side of the Tavernaitis River here, and as you can see, this pylon is peppered in bullet holes. And what we know is because it's west-facing, these are bullet holes that were made by the advancing German paratroopers before they took the bridge. Now we're on the other side of the pylon, and you can see we're facing east, and there's a few bullet holes here, probably rifle fire. And that, of course, was coming from the far bank where the New Zealand troops were dug in, using their rifles to try and stem the German attack. But look here. Look at the size of the holes on this pylon, closer to the airfield. What this shows is heavy German machine gun fire pouring down on the defenders on the far bank.
The Allied forces were blamed for their slow response to the attack on the Maleme airfield. At the end of the crucial first day, the German paratroopers had secured a foothold on the airport perimeter, and the battle was balanced on a knife edge.
It's almost a miracle that they did not lose the battle on the first day. Had Freiberg sent a company on the hill west of Tavernaitis, they would have not survived as well.
The few paratroopers who survived the initial landings take up good positions, and by the end of the day, the Dominion troops have abandoned the airfield that's going to give the Germans their access point. This is just catastrophic.
The airfield at Maleme was defended by a very small contingent on its western flank, and it was there that the Germans punctured the defence and got hold of that airfield, and that was what turned the battle. And Freiberg's disposition of his forces really contributed to the German success.
Despite the German advances, New Zealand brigades still occupied the olive groves on what was known as Hill 107, which had an elevated position overlooking the airstrip. But what happened next was critical.
On the 20th of May, the Germans are massacred. The bridgehead on the airfield is held by a German doctor, and as he said, had the New Zealanders counterattacked that night, we would have had to fight them off with our knives and stones because we were so short of ammunition.
This is point 107, the highest point of Hill 107, which was the vital strategic higher ground above the airfield that basically decided the battle for Maleme. The 22nd New Zealand Battalion basically had defensive positions all around the hill, over across the airfield and towards Tavernaitis Bridge along the perimeter of the river.
The New Zealand officer commanding the Hill 107 position, Lieutenant Colonel Leslie Andrew, who'd won a Victoria Cross in World War I, said the bombing incurred by his troops on May 20 made what he'd witnessed in the Battle of the Somme appear like a picnic.
It's important to remember a couple of things about Andrew. He was injured in that devastating air attack that had happened first thing in the morning. Communications were in disarray after that attack. He could not contact his companies by the airstrip near the Tavernaitis River. And then, in a sense, that's the story of Maleme and the story of the Battle of Crete, is that companies' units were fighting in isolation. So Andrew didn't know what was going on in different parts of the battlefield.
And throughout the day, they'd been under intense mortar, ground and air attack. The Luftwaffe attack has led to a nervous collapse on his part. Even though his companies on the hill are not under direct attack, he decides that he's going to withdraw. Something happens on the 20th that breaks him. Doesn't break his battalion. His battalion has been trained and prepared to do what they did, and they do it. But at the heart of the battalion, the man who makes the decisions is broken. An idea of Andrew's state of mind can be gained from the words that he spoke to Royal. He said, "You were lucky to get off the hill alive." And in fact, there is no activity on the hill.
So Andrew decided to pull the New Zealanders off this hill. And once he'd done that, the Germans...
Early morning, day 2, Maleme airfield. The German commander, General Student, takes a huge risk, which turns the battle.
He decided to send some daredevil on his staff into the Maleme airfield at dawn to see if a Junkers 52 could actually land there, or it was still under artillery fire. It was a calculated risk, but it came off.
The Battle of Crete was decided here, on this airstrip. The whole airstrip on the second day was still under fire, was still being protected by the New Zealand troops, but because they'd moved off Hill 107, there was a window of opportunity for the Germans to get in, and they did. And what they did was they landed their transports, crash-landed them in some cases, even after being hit. They would land them on the beach, on the coast here, and suddenly the balance of power had shifted. Suddenly there was an air bridge into Crete, which allowed the Germans to dominate the situation here and to put increasing pressure onto the defenders. Once they had started to fly in scores of aircraft, which littered this airstrip full of ammunition, reinforcements, troops, supplies, guns, motorbikes, they had it now. They had a foothold in Crete, and that was key, because it would affect every single battle from then on.
Within a day or two, he got something like 10,000 mountain troops, which made up for the very heavy casualties that the German parachutists had on the first day.
Freyberg was heavily criticised for continuing to plan for a seaborne attack and for spreading his forces too thinly across Crete's northern coast. British historians said it would prove the most costly and strategic miscalculation brief campaign.
He, as a First World War officer, could not believe that an island could be captured from the air. And so when he heard in the ultra decrypts, the signals intelligence decrypts, that there was going to be a reinforcement coming by sea, he immediately turned everything back to front, and he believed, therefore, that it was going to be a seaborne invasion, basically backed by an airborne attack. And so everything was back to front, and this was actually the reason why the island fell.
So the standard intelligence dilemma is, do you use the information you have now and risk discovery, or do you use it more sparingly in order to preserve the longevity of what you have? And Freyberg is caught in that problem. So he's given very full information on what the Germans plan to do, but also told not to betray the fact that we have it. So his inclination might be to rush reinforcements to certain points, but if he does that, does that give the game away? So it's a very difficult balance for him.
But when it came to, I'm afraid, intelligence in both senses of the term, he did not have a clear mind. And the trouble was that because the ultra material was so secret, he couldn't discuss it with anybody else. He'd been ordered not to.
So you could say, probably, perhaps unfairly, that he was the first commander in history who knew exactly what the enemy was doing and still managed to lose the battle.
But New Zealand historians say Freyberg's planning was correct, but he was let down by his brigade commanders at Maleme.
I believe that people who criticise Freyberg on Crete have studied the maps but haven't walked the ground. He had to fight a series of independent battles, but he knew right from the outset, because of Ultra, that the German target were the airfields.
Pugsley says Andrew's commander, Brigadier James Hargest, was too slow to respond once Andrew had pulled off Hill 107. And then his commander, Brigadier Edward Puttock, then failed to provide reinforcements.
The failure is not Freiburg's. The failure is New Zealand commanders within the New Zealand division. At each level, a New Zealand commander hesitates, makes the wrong decision. A lack of initiative and dysfunctional commanders lose Crete. And that was New Zealand's failing, but it's certainly not Freiburg's, because Freiburg has set a plan in place, and the Brits under Chappell carry it out, the Australians under Campbell carry it out, and the New Zealanders failed to carry it. Had Andrew done nothing, the New Zealanders would have won that battle. But he decides to withdraw, and that's pulling on that piece of wool, and the entire jumper unravels, because Crete is lost from that point.
They failed to understand that the critical point for an airborne invasion is the place where you can land the transport planes and bring in the non-paratroopers. And so, yes, the long airfield that had been improved for Royal Air Force bombers to fly from ends up being the sally port through which the besieging forces come, to use a medieval analogy. That's the open door. They could have done better. They could have dug up the airfield. They could have filled it with junk so it was useless. They could have made a better effort, and by the end of the first day, they'd essentially lost the key to the whole position. The airfield is the one that's nearest to Germany. It's the one over which the Messerschmitt 109s can operate for just enough time to be useful. The other end of Crete, 109s can't even operate. So it really was the pivot point of the battle, and to lose that on the first, essentially the first day, really poor.
Despite a bold counterattack at Maleme, involving brave fighting from Freiburg's New Zealand brigades, it came too late, and the Allies were unable to take the airfield, allowing the Germans to begin building a crucial bridgehead. This enabled the landing of more paratroopers and hardened fighters from the 7th Mountain Division. With the Maleme airbase finally secure, it took each Ju-52 just over a minute to touch down, drop their troops, and take off. As the reinforcements arrived, the invaders began spreading out.
The German army had a system of operations where the mission was devolved down to the lowest level of officer, NCO, corporal, sergeants, and then a private. So in many armies, when the officer dies, the soldiers stop because they don't know what the mission is. But in the German army, the tactics devolve down. So when the officer dies, the sergeant takes over. If the sergeant is killed, the corporal takes over. So it keeps the momentum going. And even the lowliest private knows what the mission is. And what he knows is he has to achieve the mission. How he achieves it is up to him. So it gives the German army a very aggressive, kinetic momentum. The two planes, single-engine planes, that are used most directly in close air support are the Messerschmitt 109 and the Stuka, the Ju-87, the Junker 87. The Junker 87 is very famous because when it comes down, it makes this shrill noise, which is a sort of terrifying scream, and then it releases its bomb at the bottom part of its dive, and then obviously pulls up.
The Stuka is nothing but a precise artillery to the spot. When the mountaineers moved forward, they were assisting them.
Many of the troops on Crete remember the scream of the ME-109 coming over on strafing runs.
They were able to drop bombs to the meat.
Next time, with victory for the Germans at Maleme now secure, the Allies would begin a series of dramatic rearguard and counterattack actions. 20,000 of their troops were still on Crete. How to protect them and get them off the island. As the Allied troops fell back from the Maleme airfield, a series of bitter battles occurred, the first of which was in the village of Galatas. Every year, this modest memorial is the site of a commemorative service attended by Cretan and New Zealand dignitaries.
And this was, in the words of Bernard Freyberg, the commander-in-chief of the New Zealand troops, it was the hardest and most savage battle that the New Zealand Division fought in World War II. And this is up there. This was a man who was also in command in Cassino.
The narrow lanes and streets of Galatas were the site of bitter, close-quarters combat. Given its strategic importance atop a small hill between the lost airport Maleme and the Allied lines between Hanya and Suda Bay to the east, it was the first of several rearguard positions taken by the Allies. Even today, war relics have a useful purpose in the old houses here. The historic city of Hanya, occupied by the Venetians for 450 years, was heavily bombarded. 13 Venetian palaces were destroyed in a brutal bombing campaign. The first of many thousands of POWs were already being rounded up. In addition, there was the gruesome task of burying the dead. There were atrocities on both sides. The Royal Navy's role in the unfolding battle would be crucial. Initially tasked with intercepting German reinforcements arriving by sea, the fleet had needed to sail from Egypt and was repeatedly attacked by dive bombers. For the British, there would be more casualties at sea than on land. Admiral Cunningham, the commander of the Mediterranean Fleet, had nearly 30 ships off Crete on the morning of the invasion. 2 battleships, 8 cruisers, and 17 destroyers. But over the course of the battle, 2/3, 17, would either be sunk, damaged, or lost.
The major port infrastructure, such as it is in Crete, is all to the north of the island, and the British base, which is going to act for resupply, is essentially Alexandria. So you've got a 420-mile supply line, and the last part of that is within range of German air power. They're going to have to travel a significant proportion of this at night to avoid being seen by aircraft or attacked by aircraft. Bringing in of supplies and extra resources from Egypt has to be done by the Royal Navy. Now, if you'd had a good port on the south coast of Crete, that would have been significantly easier. But it isn't, so every supply will have to go either east or west of the island, which makes it a very predictable route for those who want to interdict this. We're trying to make sure you arrive at a particular point at a particular time, so you can do the last leg under cover of darkness. If anything goes wrong and you're visible in German-controlled skies when the sun rises, as sometimes happens, you're in trouble. And this puts a lot of strain on the naval personnel, but they keep going anyway. Once we're in Crete, they also have to try and stop the Germans or the Italians landing by sea on Crete, and that obliges them to run operations to the north of the island under German air attack. And the German air attack is very efficient, and when you're at the end of your 420 miles, route, if you face a German air attack, you could expend 70-80% of your anti-aircraft ammunition fighting it off, and then you're left with a decision: Do we go home whilst we can still defend ourselves, or do we keep going with whatever particular task we've got? And the men who are operating the ships are under considerable strain, Stuckeritis, as some of them call it, you know, under continuous air attack from German dive bombers and bombers. They lose a lot of people and a lot of ships.
The two most serious losses, the cruisers Gloucester and Fiji, are sunk when they're sent back to pick up survivors, and they don't have enough anti-aircraft ammunition on board. They're not capable of defending themselves. That sense that you go back for your people is a really important part of building morale, particularly for a navy. So they did that, but they didn't check whether those ships had the firepower to go back and do the job. So that's 20,000 tons of cruisers sunk, essentially because they haven't checked the ammunition lockers.
One of them, HMS Gloucester, would lose 715 out of a crew of just over 800. Melvin Baker was on the Gloucester when it was sunk.
The inevitable happened. We ran out of anti-aircraft ammunition, and the Luftwaffe had so much force of planes coming at us right, left and centre that eventually we took one too many bombs, and that was the end of the Gloucester. I thought to myself, look, I'm going to survive this. There's no way I'm going to give up. Because a lot of people, to me, they were virtually hardly any time in the water, and they just gave up. They just floated away. They made no effort to save themselves. And others were clambering over and just about drowned. A few of them just about drowned me, trying to use me to lever themselves out the water and all the rest of it. As the numbers dwindled, then I was able to get onto the raft sometime during the night. Eventually, a German plane flew over, and when I saw this coming towards us, I thought, oh, please, no more machine gunning, because there were machine guns in the water, and dropped bombs amongst us when we got to shortly after we were sunk. And the crew was absolutely exhausted. That's why I think so many of them that had enough, they just gave up. We were left in the water, and if the Germans had not picked us up the next day, not one of us would be alive. I lost a lot of friends there, because there were only 4 of the South Africans survived. Yeah, there were 32 on board and 4 of them survived.
Its sister ship, HMS Fiji, lost 250 hands when it too was sunk on May 22nd, attempting to help rescue crew from the destroyer HMS Greyhound. Norman Lewis was a bandsman on the Fiji who survived.
She went down about 5 o'clock in the evening in broad daylight. And unfortunately, those chaps who were in the water were machine gunned by the Germans from their planes. I suppose 600 or 700 of the crew in the water, we didn't see a soul. Strange, isn't it? They all sort of drift away with the tide. And we just sort of floated and moved around in the dark. You get so cold, and you just had to keep singing or talking or doing something to keep you awake. Otherwise you just go to sleep, and away you'd go. We saw that pinprick of light, just that tiny light in the distance. And that sort of lifted our spirits. We made for it as best we could. Of the 15 of the band, there were 7 of us. And we thought, well, the other 8 would be on the Kingston. But we wouldn't know until we got back to Alexandra. And when we went ashore and gathered in this huge shed building, there was only one, Albert. The other 6, unfortunately, we lost. Like many, many times, I just asked the question, why? Yeah, why?
The HMS Kelly, a destroyer commanded by a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, a future Sea Lord and Viceroy of India, but then only a Captain Louis Mountbatten, was also among the ships sunk. Mountbatten lost half his crew of 200, the others, including himself, rescued from the sea while still being machine-gunned by some of the 27 Stukas that had attacked.
He's picked up in the water, and he's brought back and goes on to greater things, and he's able to tell this story.
Plymouth has a long tradition as a naval city, and remembrance ceremonies here commemorate the losses at sea during the Battle of Crete. Eve Farden lost her 18-year-old brother when the HMS Gloucester was sunk.
My brother lost his life. That's the name. That's my brother? Eddie. He was 18. He joined the Navy as a boy to see the Royal 16, sailed from Devonport.
Dimitri Skatsalakis runs the bakery his grandparents, who witnessed the war, founded, producing all manner of cakes and sweets. But at home, he's amassed a collection of war paraphernalia, collected from the Rethmanon battlefield, and more than 8,000 photographs. Many obtained from Germany, even the personal albums of German soldiers.
It contains many pictures from the time of, from the early stages of the war, we can say. Then it goes to the Battle of Crete. This particular album has about 100 pictures from the Battle of Crete. Well, we could say that these are the true photos, not propaganda photos, everyday life, killed soldiers, graves, prisoners of war, their comrades in the plane, bombings, everything. We can find a lot of information in these albums.
Further east, in Heraklion, the German paratroopers had been dropped on and around the city. Heraklion today still has a busy sea and airport. But by the 28th of May 1941, it was decided to evacuate sorely pressed troops from Heraklion. A force of 9 Royal Navy ships, including 6 destroyers, had been sent from Alexandria.
4 destroyers arrived, took off the entire force. Dive bombers followed, did horrible damage at sea.
Alf Carpenter was evacuated on the HMS Imperial and survived.
As soon as daylight came, the dive bombers started coming on us, and the skipper of the ship was on his back up in the wheelhouse with his binoculars, and every time one of the dive bombers, they started to let go a bomb, he'd sing out harder port, harder starboard, so he was zigzagging his way out of the things that were coming down.
2 ships out of the 9-ship convoy had been sunk, and 3 more badly damaged, including the flagship Orion. More than 600 lives were lost.
After that, when the dive bombers come in, we had enough lead going in the air to keep them out of the way. We brought one plane down, and that's how we got back to Alexandria.
Englische Arroganz. Jetzt darf noch frech werden, Tommy.
While many Allied soldiers on the north coast were surrendering or being evacuated, thousands were heading for the south coast in hope of an evacuation by the Royal Navy at Sfakia. On this forced march across the island, weary soldiers were constantly exposed to overhead attack by German fighters, abandoning their equipment along the way. Already exhausted troops would rest here at Vrissus, by the stream, before beginning an ascent on the one road up into the mountains. Nowadays in spring, brilliant red poppies line the road to Sfakia. In 1941, it was little more than a dirt donkey track. Now paved and widened, it's lonely still for most of the day, with only the occasional passing car and sounds of goats in the field disturbing the silence. Traditions remain on Crete. Today, shepherds and their sheep take priority on these narrow mountain roads. As it winds up, the landscape becomes rocky and barren. All along the road to Sfakia, rearguard troops were installed at strategic points to slow down the German pursuit. As almost 20,000 fleeing troops tried to get off the island. The evacuation route has been mapped by writer and historian Michael Sweet.
On the morning of the 29th of May, this was the first blocking point on the mountain. Here, New Zealand troops were on the high ground, Australian troops with them, all the way over to the peak over there. And what they saw early on the morning of the 29th of May was German troops coming through the pass down there. What they did with the rearguard was they would set up a blocking point for a few hours, lay down fire on the advancing Germans, slowing them down, slowing the German advance down, buying time for the troops to get off at the evacuation beach, and then they would leapfrog back, covering each other.
In 1941, as now, the departing troops then reached the Askifu Plateau, a fertile valley overlooked by an old Turkish fortress. The Turks, like all other invaders, never really controlled this part of the island. The fort only remained here for 10 years of their 300-year occupation.
The next blocking point was over there, the entrance to the Askifu Plain. It was known as the saucer to the troops in those days. And what happened there was a group of 50 men armed with machine guns, rifles, a mortar, and actually a tank managed to hold back the Germans for about 3 hours. What the sum total of that meant for the rearguard for that night's evacuation is that 6,000 troops got away.
The valley is tranquil today, but 80 years ago the skies buzzed with German aircraft, exercising their supreme military power. The evacuating troops were vulnerable here, and more equipment was jettisoned. It's found a home in a private museum run by Andras, whose father started it just after the war. He also collected German equipment later found abandoned. It gives an idea of how well equipped the Germans were. These backpacks were fur-lined, so as to be used as pillows too. Continuing on, the road to Sfakia then descends down precipitous gorges and mountainsides. The hairpin bends today give an indication of the journey thousands of soldiers had to make by foot. The road stops 3 kilometres, 500 feet above the village of Sfakia and the coast.
We're at a position where the old road finished, and the aim was to get to Sfakia, which is over there. There was no modern road in those days. There was a goat track, basically, from where the old road finished through to Sfakia. Thousands of them came down. It's hard to imagine the scale of what we're talking about here. Thousands of them had crossed the White Mountains, were coming down the gorges, were going towards Sfakia or towards Komitadis. You have to imagine that this plain was full of thousands of soldiers, and they all wanted to get on the boats. They were exhausted. They had fought for 7, 8 days. They had had hardly any food. They had been harassed in the daytime by German fighters for nearly 2 weeks. They were at the end of their tether. They were in a dreadful state. They were so hungry and thirsty then that some of them resorted to chasing wild chickens, killing them and eating them raw. That's how bad it was. The Germans had split up. They had come forward from Askifu. They had gone down the ravines on the right-hand and the left-hand side. And on the night of the 31st, the last unit that was on this mountain, protecting the troops going to the beaches, was the 2nd 7th Battalion, the Australian battalion.
A lot of those blokes were carrying ammunition in their pockets. Some of them were barefoot. They were carrying any rifles they could pick up. They'd fought a great rearguard action, fighting the Germans every step of the way. You know, very, very gallant retreat. The Germans knew if they pushed them too hard, they were going to butt up against some very, very fine soldiers, some well-disciplined soldiers.
Today, the only boats leaving the small port here are tourist ferries going back and forward along the coast. Tourists queue in orderly fashion for tickets. It was vastly different in the last days of May 1941. A memorial dockside commemorates what happened.
This is the beach at Korosvakion, the end of the road for the Allies in May 1941. It was here on May the 31st that the last evacuation took place. This place was crowded. There were thousands of men hanging around, desperate to get onto the evacuation boats. There was a cordon of armed pickets around the men so that they wouldn't rush the boats, the last boats. People were desperate. There were people trying to cheat the lines. There were queues all the way back up the hillside. There was a pecking order, officers first. There was a pecking order politically, a certain number of Australians, a certain number of New Zealanders, a certain number of Brits. But people were trying to get past the ordering system, so that people would try and cheat their way through the lines, push their way through. This is all happening in the dead of night, yeah, with these throngs of soldiers hanging around, hungry, thirsty, desperate to get off this island. The 2nd 7th Australian Battalion was coming down from the hill that night. They were the last ones of the rear guard, that last unit in the rear guard to keep the Germans at bay. The Germans were advancing from the east, from the west, and from the gorge from Askifu Plain. The 2nd 7th came down that night. They left their positions at about 10 o'clock. They had a really difficult climb down the mountain. Then they got to the thousands waiting, who resented them going through the ranks, going through the lines. They finally got here to the harbour's edge, and they found that the last barge had gone. And what they could hear in the distance a little while later was the hawser, the anchor, being taken up on the destroyer. And they, along with 5,000 other troops, would stay here, abandoned, and become, almost all of them, prisoners of war.
The Navy did everything they could, but there was only so much space. They got destroyers and cruisers. You know, they couldn't send a troop ship in, so the numbers that could get off were very limited.
This is Dunkirk on a slightly smaller scale. There's an army there to be relieved. The Germans have complete command of the sky, and the Navy goes in and rescues them. In this case, not just with small ships, but with big ones as well. And yeah, it takes a hell of a beating doing that.
They know that if you operate in coastal waters where the enemy dominates the skies, you're in trouble. It's not a surprise for them, but they do it anyway, and they pull people off successfully, and the losses are, in the end, sustainable.
Of the thousands who made it to Egypt, there was one Australian officer offered a place on the boats who was not among them, opting to stay instead with his men. Colonel Theo Walker then walked several kilometres along the coast from Sfakia to the small village of Komitates. It looks much the same today as it did then. It was here that Walker, the most senior officer left on the island, would officially deliver the Allied surrender.
Komitates is in a way the end of the story of the Battle of Crete, the battle itself. Of course, the Battle of Crete didn't end on June the 1st. The Allies surrendered. 5,000 Allied soldiers became prisoners of war. Others took to the hills to fight, to try and escape. The Germans began 4 long years of occupation. And in villages like this, the resistance started against the German occupation. So one battle was over, but another had begun.
For the Anzac forces, the Battle of Crete represented a reminder of their famous defeat at Gallipoli a quarter of a century earlier. A campaign that, ironically, had made heroes of the battle commanders on Crete. For New Zealand Commander General Freyberg, another Gallipoli hero, who in the end had spent 10 years of his life fighting the Germans. He would spend the rest of his life defending his decisions and tactics, which his critics maintained lost the island. For the man that commanded Australia's ragtag Cretan forces, Australia's most decorated soldier, General Blamey, also a Gallipoli hero, it was a blemish on a glittering career that had spanned 2 world wars. He was accused of evacuating himself off the island before his troops, and he and other World War I veterans could not escape the criticism that they were old and out of step with modern-day warfare.
One of the problems that the army on Crete faces is that they're led by people who've done this all before on the other way. You know, the Allies, British Dominion troops tried to get into the Gallipoli beachheads. Blamey and Freyberg are both there. It doesn't work. So invading across the sea, probably not going to work. Probably made them feel quite confident. They're sitting there with quite a lot of troops. They've got the Royal Navy behind them. What can go wrong? And also, being a brave and effective junior leader in the First World War doesn't mean you're going to cut the mustard as a senior leader in the Second World War. And quite a lot of soldiers fail to make that transition from commanding men under fire to actually conducting war. So the great generals of the Second World War are few in number, and none of them are on Crete.
In military terms, it's a young men's game, and they were older than Napoleon was at Waterloo. And we see the same thing with Napoleon, where he knows what he wants to do. His strategy in getting to Waterloo is superb, but his timing is off in the battle itself.
Despite the huge losses, these were papered over and the battle was marked with victory parades back in Germany.
The invasion of Crete was celebrated by German propaganda at extraordinary length.
Dem deutschen Soldaten ist nichts unmöglich.
The propaganda would ultimately prove empty. The German boxing champion Max Schmeling, who beat Joe Louis in 1936 to become world champion, became a Nazi pin-up. He jumped with the paratroopers, but hurt himself landing, although the Cretans say he was wounded.
It's a great PR coup. Nazi Germany's super athlete lands as a warrior on this hostile island. It's perfect. You can just imagine how Joseph Goebbels is going to work this into his next publicity broadcast. So modernity is a key element of fascism, and the parachute invasion is a very modern response.
Nazi propaganda pronounced a triumph as awards for the paratroopers were dished out by their commander-in-chief Hermann Göring. Losses were extremely high, however. German commander General Kurt Student would dub Crete the graveyard of the German paratroopers and a disastrous victory. Almost 2,000 German troops were killed on the first day of the invasion alone, out of 4,400 dead. Another 2,600 were wounded in less than 12 days of fighting. Dead and wounded meant half the paratroopers' fighting force became casualties.
Normally, you would expect 3 times as many wounded as killed in a conventional battle. Here we found that there was far more were killed than wounded, which gives you an idea, actually, of quite how lethal the fighting was.
The number of casualties meant that Hitler would never again approve the use of paratroopers in such large-scale operations. More than 250 aircraft, including 150 of the Ju-52 transports, were lost.
And they don't have 250 aircraft to throw away. They're about to launch the biggest operation of their Second World War, Barbarossa, and this Air Force is going to move out of Greece up onto the Russian front. They lose a significant number of pilots, and all the way through the war, quality personnel are going to be critical. By the end of the war, the Germans have plenty of planes, but they've run out of pilots. And they end up with a very large commitment to garrisoning Crete, which ties down a lot of troops for the rest of the war. Because the one thing that the Cretans demonstrate is they really, really, really do not like the Germans, and they still don't.
On the Allied side, 3,000 were dead and a dozen warships lost. More than 12,000 Allied soldiers would be taken prisoner of war, 1/3 of the defending force.
Crete is a position that should have been held, but there's a complete failure of joined-up thinking. If the Royal Air Force had had single-seat fighters operating off Crete, there would have been no Stuka attacks on the Royal Navy, and the Royal Navy would have operated much more effectively because it would not have been under constant air attack. The Air Force had to support the Army and the Navy over Crete, and they didn't.
The loss didn't go down well in some parts of the British Empire. Australian Prime Minister Menzies lost power in August 1941, in part due to his conduct of the war in Europe, and in particular in Greece and Crete.
Menzies doesn't come out of this very well because he had agreed to go to London for a 3-4 month period to sit in with the British War Cabinet to concert Australian plans in the overall strategy.
New Zealand Prime Minister Peter Fraser was in Alexandria, welcoming his evacuated and exhausted troops and urging the British to go back to Crete to get more. Menzies was nowhere to be seen.
His reputation was really very damaged by the events in Crete, and his leadership never survived in the Second World War. He was replaced within weeks of returning to Australia.
Australian historians blame Churchill for deceiving the Anzac forces.
He committed the Australians and New Zealanders and the rest of the expeditionary force to Crete to a hopeless cause, really. The Australians were used, really, as part of this overall political purpose of Churchill's, which didn't really square with Australian national interest.
Churchill committed Commonwealth and British troops to Greece to impress American public opinion. But that obviously was not something that you could sell to governments in Canberra and Wellington, and so the British crafted a narrative to tell the Australians and New Zealanders that there would be tanks going to Greece, there would be air cover, and that there was a reasonable prospect of success, when really there was none.
What were their choices? Do you surrender mainland Europe without a fight? Do you surrender the sea lanes, the approaches to the Suez Canal and to British possessions in Egypt without a fight? I don't think British High Command had an option.
There were wider consequences. The devastated British Mediterranean fleet had been expected to head east into the Pacific.
It cost ships, and this was at a time when the threat was growing in the Far East, and there was always the belief, and this was again a false bit of British planning, the British would have enough time to get the bulk of their fleet out to the Far East by the time the Japanese attacked. And that wasn't true, and above all, they didn't have the aircraft to be able to defend their ships because they had underestimated the way that the balance of power in air war and sea war had changed completely.
In 1914, the British went to war with 65 battleships. In 1939, they had 15. They just don't have the numbers to do the job. By the end of this campaign, the Mediterranean fleet really doesn't have much more than a couple of cruisers and a few destroyers. It's basically burned itself up dealing with this campaign, both first securing the island and then getting the troops off. And you start to see that the Royal Navy is running out of assets to fire brigade the next crisis. So when Japan strikes in December 1941, they're lucky to get 2 capital ships to send out to the Far East. They don't have anything else. There's just nothing left in the locker.
So what the British did to honour 20 years of promises that a fleet would go to Singapore to defend Australia was to send an old battle cruiser, the Repulse, and one modern battleship, the Prince of Wales, without an aircraft carrier, without any submarines, with too few destroyers, no motor torpedo boats, and the whole thing was a gesture.
But the cost of the battle to the Germans had high strategic value for the Allies. It was credited with delaying the ultimately ill-fated Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of Russia later that year. And German aggression in North Africa and the Mediterranean stalled as a battered Royal Navy interrupted supply routes. General Kurt Student, the World War I fighter ace who'd built the German paratroopers into such an innovative, feared and daring airborne fighting force, went on to salvage his reputation to some extent with a daring and successful raid, also using gliders, that rescued Mussolini from a remote mountaintop in northern Italy after he'd been deposed and captured by Italian royalists. But Student never recovered from the huge losses in the Battle of Crete, and after the war served a prison sentence for war crimes on the island. Overlooking Maleme Airport today are the graves of the feared Fallschirmjäger, or sky hunters, more than 3,000 killed in the Battle of Crete alone. At the commemoration ceremony, veterans from past and present paratrooper divisions are in attendance.
This being together, the staying for each other, living together, fighting together. This is a specific, very specific ethos. It is what we call in German Kameradschaft.
The feared face of Nazi aggression took on a more benign face after the end of the war. But at the end of the ceremony, and in a far corner of the cemetery, some paratroopers still sing the anthem, which the Fallschirmjäger sang before and during World War II. It's a tradition these men still wear with pride. Today, German dignitaries attend the main Allied memorial services too. But even 80 years later, Germans find themselves in an uncomfortable situation. As the aggressors, their shocking losses and counterclaims of atrocities still receive scant attention.
Some officers still tried to bring up the memory of the Battle of Crete, but these activities were not liked, they were not accepted, and in the end, I think they just faded out. So we had no active remembrance and recollection.
After an historic invasion by air and 10 days of fierce fighting in May 1941, German forces were in effective control of the island of Crete. With the majority of Allied troops captured, evacuated, or literally escaping into the hills, in the last days of May 1941, with the Germans victorious, the remaining Allied troops had streamed south from the battle zones around Hanya, heading to Spakia and their evacuation point. Cretan irregulars had put up fierce resistance during the battle, and they continued this resistance as the occupation began to take hold.
So they used sticks, rocks, tools from the fields, whatever they had, and they fought.
This would lead to brutal and bloody reprisals.
There were significant massacres of civilians. There was a very unpleasant partisan war on both sides. And it's left a deep scar in a way that only a country that's been occupied and brutalized can possibly understand. And we have to understand what it's like to be under enemy occupation by a regime that has no compunction in slaughtering large numbers of civilians, many of whom will be innocent.
The Germans had a bad reputation for not taking prisoners, and there were certainly accounts of German paratroopers murdering civilians. You know, paratroopers are trained to be aggressive. They know that they're always going to jump into hostile territory. They know they're always going to be surrounded. And so these are aggressive young men in a desperate situation. So they are not the sort of soldiers you can rely on to take prisoners.
So when the German forces entered Crete, they of course were surprised, first, then annoyed, then of course full of fear of those acts being committed against individual soldiers. And there were, would not deny this, terrible acts being committed on individual soldiers.
There were a lot of reprisals against the civilian population, especially the villages which were in the Amari and so forth, which were focuses of resistance. The Germans got to know which ones they were, and they carried out these sweeps through the mountains with troops. But in most cases, the Andates, the guerrillas, got away before they arrived. But there were clashes, and then quite often they would kill many of the civilians in one of the villages involved.
It was very much a kind of action and reaction, serious, brutal, and in a way exceeding all what was necessary and probably being accepted.
German Commander General Student would stand trial for war crimes for ordering German responses to Cretan resistance. The reprisals endorsed by the head of the Air Force, Göring, were numerous and alluded to in notices distributed by the Germans.
A lot of historians now believe that you can trace the military behaviour of the German army or armies to civilians from pretty much 1870 through to the Second World War. Some of the brutality you get in the Second World War is this combination of an existing German military culture with Nazi ideology superimposed upon it, and the two in combination is really quite frightening.
In Condamare on June the 2nd, 1941, 22 men were shot by German paratroopers. Commanded by Lieutenant Horst Trebers, a former Hitler Youth member and the only officer of his battalion to survive the invasion unscathed. A German journalist who took these photos of the execution and helped a Cretan escape was court-martialed. Vasilis was 8 and witnessed the massacre.
Οι Γερμανοί κυκλώσαν το χωριό και μαζεύανε όσους βρίσκανε και στα χωράφια που εργαζότανε και τους συγκεντρώνανε εδώ, χωρίζοντας τους νέους από τα γυναικόπαιδα και τους γέρους. Στην επιλογή που κάνανε αργότερα είπανε ότι από 18 χρόνων μέχρι 50 ετών.
Vasilis' uncle was among those executed.
Την είδα, γιατί μετά που φύγανε οι Γερμανοί έτρεξαν οι συγγενείς των εκτελεσθέντων, πολλοί μάλιστα μείνανε και το βράδυ εδώ μανάδες και αδερφές και σύζυγοι για το φόβο μήπως τα σκυλιά ή οι γάτες επιτεθούν στα διαλυμένα κυρίως κρανία.
Δεν τα πήρανε.
Όχι, δεν επιτρέψαν να τα φούνε. Την επομένη ήρθανε δυο με μια μοτοσυκλέτα και μετρήσανε τα πτώματα και αν θυμάμαι καλά τη δεύτερη μέρα πια είπαν να τα φούνε. Η θηριωδία των Ναζί ήταν τέτοια που παρά το διαλυμένο των εκτελεσθέντων επακολούθησε και η χαριστική βολή λεγόμενη.
Here in Kandanos on June the 3rd, the very next day, just 2 days after the surrender, villagers were punished for holding up German motorcycle divisions who were heading south along the mountain road to the village of Paliokra to stop the Allies landing reinforcements on the island's south coast. 25 German soldiers had been killed in the action. The villagers would pay dearly for their actions a few days later. Fearing retaliation, the villagers had taken refuge in the surrounding hills. The Germans entered the village and razed it to the ground.
On the day of the 3rd of June 1941, a special regiment came with a command from the city of Heraklion. They reached the village of Kandanos on 3rd of June. They would enter villages. There were some incidents of looting. They would place dynamite strategically in the walls of the houses. They would place white phosphorus to ignite them. They would place grenades inside people's villages, blow up and burn the village. Nothing was saved. Again, we have incidents of executing people on the spot. Anyone who was caught inside his village was executed on the spot and left to die. The entire village was blown up.
Την ίδια μέρα, πάλι όσους βρήκαν στους δρόμους, στα σπίτια τους εκτέλεσαν. Οι κάτοικοι που είχαν φύγει από την Κάντανο και στα βουνά.
As the regiment entered the village, gunshots were sounded. Expect more dead as you hear the gunshots from the mountains around us. And then they watched in horror as columns on fire and explosions razed the village to the ground. Up to 15 days later, people were able to see columns of fire and smoke coming out of the wreckage of the village, and that is because the entire southwest Crete is based on olive oil production.
Αυτή την εικόνα, τη θλιβερή εικόνα, να μένουν χωρίς σπίτια, συν τους νεκρούς που είχαν. Φέρανε οι Γερμανοί δύο...
Later the Germans came back. They found a door from a house and they took the blackboard of the school and they wrote on it, "Because you took up arms against us, because you murder our soldiers and not just let them pass by without harm, this village was razed to the ground, never to be rebuilt again."
Θέλησαν να μην υπάρχει Κάντανος.
Article 3/13 forbid the shooting of civilians without a military judge being present. Kurt Student ordered that officers could order execution, could decide on the spot how many hostages should be shot, what should happen to the men, women and children, how villages should be treated. Even the looting of villages was legitimate as a kind of repercussions to certain actions. But this is a clear violation of the army regulations, the German army regulations, but also, of course, of the conduct of war laid down in the Hague Convention of 1907.
The Cretans would pay dearly for protecting Allied soldiers who would be left behind after the evacuation. Several thousand had been taken prisoner, but hundreds took to the mountains in southern Crete, where they were protected for months, even years, by Cretan families. German authorities knew the Allied soldiers were on the run and issued leaflets demanding they surrender, or else. In the coming months, several individual groups of these escapees would make their way in small craft across the Mediterranean to Africa. One of the first was Australian Stan Carroll, who later demonstrated how he made the final leg of the journey with just a steel can to keep him afloat after spending several weeks on a solo escape trek on a small boat he found on the south coast. Finally reunited with his battalion in Egypt, he alerted the Allies about the number of stranded soldiers still on Crete.
Tidge Carroll was able to tell them that there were dozens of others, potentially hundreds of others Australians, who had got away and were hiding in the cliffs on the south coast of Crete. And it was Carroll's story that inspired the British to get their SOE teams in and re-establish communication, catch up with those survivors, and that led to the mass rescue of Australian and New Zealand and British evading troops on the south coast of Crete.
A number of other groups also made daring escapes. This group of Australians sailed to Egypt in a craft powered by sails made from army blankets stitched together with bootlaces. These soldiers, who manned the rearguard against advancing Germans but were left behind, also escaped by small boat and were picked up at sea. A group of New Zealanders seen here on the south coast commandeered this small craft to sail to Egypt too. Hundreds of other soldiers were protected by Cretan families or hid out in the hills and caves awaiting rescue. In Sfakia today, a memorial contains the remains of 26 Cretans executed for aiding Allied soldiers.
Αυτοί παραμείναμε. Ήταν λοιπόν δυο, ο Μανώλης και ο Γλιγόρης, και τροποδότουνα 2 χρόνια. Και τον πήγαινα στο κρυό τη νύχτα, ήθελα να μαγειρέψει η μάνα μου μια μουθιά, ό,τι είχαμε, να το πάρω το σακουλάκι και να πάω τη νύχτα τον πάω φαΐ.
Οι Νεοζηλανδοί, οι Εγγλέζοι και οι Κύπροι και Αυστραλοί πιάσανε το αμάρι. Λοιπόν, ήρθαν στο άλλο μέρος πάρα πολλοί και φιλοξενούντανε από τους χωριανούς. Σε κάθε σπίτι και στο σπίτι το δικό μας ήρθανε πάρα πολλοί. Ψωμί δεν είχαμε να φάμε εμείς και το δίδανε στους ανθρώπους αυτούς. Και τους βοηθούσανε, τους οδηγούσανε προς τη μεριά του Πρέβελη και από εκεί πηγαίνανε και εφεύγανε.
The Preveli monastery in particular played a crucial role in getting the Allied soldiers off the island. The monasteries on this isolated south coast have been here for hundreds of years, and the area still has a timeless quality. Shepherds herd their goats on tiny roads, and ancient bridges constructed by the monasteries still stand. Abbots from the Greek Orthodox Church have a tradition of protecting Greek independence, going back to the Turkish occupation and before. In the Second World War under Nazi occupation, it was no different. Hundreds of Allied troops were hidden and supported by the Preveli monasteries, hiding out in caves, in isolated gorges nearby, or in the monastery itself. They included Raymond Sandover and 130 of his men, Australian defenders of Rethmanon, who'd not surrendered and taken to the hills instead. They'd be taken off by the submarine HMS Torbay in August 1941. When the last Allied soldiers escaped from here in 1943, the abbot had to go with them, as traitors had informed the Germans of his role. Today at Preveli, high above the Mediterranean, a memorial commemorates the role of the monastery and its priests who supported and protected the Allied soldiers. There were many daring escapes along the rugged south coast. Australian James Carstairs wrote a diary about life on the run, describing a tablespoon of water as his only nourishment. Others escaped from this remote gorge in western Crete in 1943. It's silent today, and a lone memorial in this isolated place alludes to the episode. Carstairs and 85 companions had been taken off by a British boat, the Hedgehog, in 1941. After their victory, the Germans had named the island Fortress Crete, and by 1943 there were 75,000 soldiers on the island. This constituted a sixth of the entire Cretan population. Crete became an important air staging post in the resupply of German forces in North Africa, where Rommel wreaked havoc until late 1942. Concerned about a British sea invasion, they embarked on an ambitious series of public works, including defences and the rebuilding of airstrips, to further fortify the island. And the Cretans were used as a labour force.
So there was a series of public works, naval bases, fortifications, airports, roads, bunkers, all that had to be constructed by the workforce of the local people. So, in fact, all Cretans from the age of 16 until the age of 50 were obliged to offer obligatory work in a regular basis. This age also sometimes fell into the age of 12.
The hated forced labour project involved half the Cretan male population at its peak, and resistance from the Cretans was met with a steady stream of reprisals. Villages were surrounded by barbed wire, labour camps established, compulsory collective punishments meted out. These were dark years for the Cretan population. With little or no money or supplies coming from their homeland, the Germans were forced to live off the Cretans.
A local German garrison could find, the village and tell them you have to bring us, 100 eggs or 3 pigs or whatever. And that was constant. So the soldiers were fed off the ground in Crete. They had not, provisions of their own.
The Germans also took over and occupied iconic Cretan sites. They established their headquarters first in Hania, where they occupied the home of the Greek and Cretan statesman Venizelos. They also established their HQ here at the Hopa Hotel, still here today. Then later they set up their headquarters further east, at the Villa Ariadne, next to the historic Minoan site of Naxos. This was the former home built by Sir Arthur Evans, the eminent British archaeologist responsible for uncovering so much of the ancient Minoan city.
Then an actual help to the German war effort in the Mediterranean.
After Mussolini was overthrown in September 1943, the Italian commander on Crete, Angelico Carta, a royalist not fascist, contacted Patrick Leigh Fermor and arranged to be smuggled to Egypt along with the defence plans for the rest of the island. Abandoning his car near the divisional headquarters at Napoli as a diversion, Carter and his comrades were then guided southwest across the island by Fermor and Greek partisans. Evading German patrols and observation planes, he rendezvoused with a British motor torpedo boat near Tsatsuro, reaching Marsa Matruh in Egypt the next afternoon. There had been more than 20,000 Italian troops stationed in eastern Crete. After the Italian armistice, most had surrendered. Hitler had instructed that they should be taken as POWs and sent to the Reich as military phase, and with German defeat looming, the Germans pulled back. In the end, the Germans remained in control of only a small pocket around Hania and Suda Bay. Crete was among the last German possessions to surrender at the end of the war. Fearful of surrendering to Cretan militias, the German commander was secretly flown to meet the British here at the Villa Ariadne, their former headquarters at Knossos, and signed this unconditional surrender document on May the 9th, 1945.
Villa Ariadne was a symbol for the British Empire because it was the Evans residence, Pendlebury's residence, and of course the Secret Service base, let's say. So maybe the Minoan, as we say in Latin, pax, the Minoan peace, okay? So he had to sign there the final surrender document.
Fearful of revenge from Cretans, the British established a perimeter and arranged to escort the Germans off the island.
The problem about taking the surrender of the German troops on Crete was basically how to protect them from the Cretans. They couldn't suddenly say, right, well, drop your weapons and you're now our prisoners, because they wouldn't have been able to save them. So they allowed them to keep their weapons to begin with and waited until a battalion, I think, of the Royal Hampshires arrived and was able to basically form a perimeter and then march them to the ships to take them into captivity. But the idea, the Germans were terrified of being handed over to the Cretan resistance because they knew that revenge could be pretty nasty, to say the least.
The Cretans' fierce defence of their island led it to being regarded as one of the most successful resistance movements of the war. Patrick Lee Fermor, the most famous British SOE agent on Crete, became an acclaimed travel writer and only died in 2011, aged 96. Today, memorials to Cretans, German and Allied soldiers who lost their lives in this conflict can be found all over the island. Cretan bitterness at their treatment by the Germans lingered for decades after the war. Two generals who were commanders of the German forces during the occupation, Generals Brauer and Müller, the so-called Butcher of Crete, were handed over by the British, tried by a Greek military court for war crimes and executed by a firing squad on May the 20th, 1947, the 6th anniversary of the invasion. Brauer is buried in the German military cemetery here, but it took decades for him and others to be laid to rest. Greek claims for war reparations dragged on for years, with the dispute preventing the remains of German soldiers killed in the Battle of Crete being interred in a permanent cemetery on Cretan soil. After being removed from their original burial place, they were stored in a monastery for almost 30 years while negotiations continued.
The whole question of the German dead from the battle was one of, shall we say, complexity, because they had prepared their own graveyards, especially the paratroopers had, and held them there. And then, of course, when it came to the surrender, they had no further control, and the British troops weren't going to leave guards necessarily on the cemeteries. I don't think there were any of those cemeteries were necessarily defaced or anything like that. There weren't any of the bodies dug up. But it wasn't until, really, the 1970s that the Germans were in a position, A, to purchase the land above Malmö, where they were going to have, on Hill 107, where they were going to have the cemetery, but also to prepare it. And of course, it required a huge amount of work, identifying the bodies so that they could all be properly reburied and identified. And of course, many of them never were identified. And in that cemetery, you can see, you know, an unknown German soldier inscribed on many of the graves.
It wasn't until 1974 that this military cemetery, containing the remains of more than 4,300 German soldiers, was established here on Hill 107, overlooking the Malmö airfield, the site of their crucial victory, but also where so many paratroopers lost their lives.